There are certain objects we keep, not because they are valuable, but because losing them would feel like losing someone all over again. For some people it's a photograph, for others it's a letter. For me it was a watch. A simple silver wristwatch that had belonged to my father. The glass was scratched. The leather strap had been replaced twice. The hands occasionally lost a few seconds each month. There was nothing remarkable about it, yet it was the most important thing I owned, because it was the last thing my father ever wore. My name is Michael. I am 27 years old and I live in Manchester. When people hear my story, they usually focus on what happened later. The strange events, the impossible coincidence, the night that changed everything. But to understand any of that, you first need to understand my father. His name was Thomas, and he was the bravest man I ever knew. Not the kind of bravery you see in films. Not dramatic. Not loud. The quiet kind. The kind that shows itself when nobody is watching. My father worked as a firefighter for nearly 20 years. He never spoke much about the difficult parts of his job. When I was a child, I used to imagine that he spent his days rescuing cats from trees and helping old ladies cross the street. Only when I got older did I understand what he really faced. Burning buildings, collapsed structures, people screaming for help. Situations most of us spend our lives hoping never to experience. Yet somehow he always came home. Tired, smelling faintly of smoke, but smiling. Always smiling. My mother used to joke that nothing could scare him. He would laugh and say, "That's because I've already got the scariest job in the world." Then he would point at me. "Being your father." I would roll my eyes. He would laugh, and for a little while everything felt safe. The strange thing about childhood is that you believe your parents are immortal. You know people die. You see it on television. You hear about it in school. But somewhere deep inside, you assume it only happens to other families. Never yours. I believed that too. Until the day everything changed. I was 16 years old. It was a cold November evening. I remember because rain tapped endlessly against our windows. The sky had been dark since late afternoon. My father was eating dinner with us when the emergency call came through. It wasn't unusual. Calls happened all the time. Usually he would finish eating before leaving. This time he stood immediately. Something in his expression changed. Something serious. He kissed my mother, placed a hand on my shoulder, then walked toward the door. Halfway outside, he turned back. For some reason, that detail never left me. The way he turned, the small smile, the calmness in his eyes. "See you later, son." Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. The fire started in an apartment building near the city center. At first, nobody thought it would become a major incident. Then the situation worsened. The flames spread faster than expected. Several residents became trapped. My father entered the building with his team. Most of the people inside were rescued, but during the final search, part of the structure collapsed. 2 firefighters never made it out. My father was one of them. The news arrived just after midnight. I don't remember much about that night. Only fragments. My mother's crying. The silence afterward. The feeling that the world had somehow shifted beneath my feet. People often describe grief as pain. For me it felt more like emptiness. A hollow space where certainty used to exist. The funeral took place under gray skies. Hundreds of people attended. Colleagues, friends, families he had helped. People I had never met. Everyone seemed to have a story about him. Everyone seemed to know a version of my father that I had never seen. A hero, a protector, a man willing to risk everything for strangers. Yet all I wanted was my dad back. After the service, one of his fellow firefighters approached me. Without saying much, he handed me a small box. Inside was the watch. The silver watch my father wore every day. The one that had survived the fire. The one they recovered from his belongings. I stared at it for a long time. Then I slipped it onto my wrist. It was slightly too large. I wore it anyway. Years passed. Life continued because life always does. School became university. University became work. Friends came and went. Relationships began and ended. But the watch remained. Always. When I moved into my first apartment, it came with me. When I graduated, it was on my wrist. When I faced difficult decisions, I found myself touching it without realizing, as if somehow it connected me to him. Perhaps that sounds foolish. Maybe it was, but grief creates habits we rarely question. Sometimes late at night, I would sit by the window and look at the watch. The ticking sound felt comforting, almost familiar, as though a small piece of my father still existed somewhere inside those moving hands. By the time I was 27, I lived alone in a quiet part of Manchester. The neighborhood was decent. Old brick buildings, small cafes, tree-lined streets. The kind of place where nothing interesting ever happened. At least that's what I thought. I worked long hours for a logistics company. Most evenings followed the same routine. Work, train, dinner, sleep. The predictability suited me. After years of struggling with loss, I had finally built something resembling peace. Or so I believed. The first sign that something was wrong arrived on a Thursday evening in December. Winter had settled over the city. The air felt sharp and cold. Darkness arrived before most people finished work. That night I left the office later than usual. Rain glistened across the pavement beneath the streetlights. The city felt strangely empty. As I walked home, I noticed an unusual sensation. A feeling. The kind you can't easily explain. The feeling that someone was watching you. At first I ignored it. Everyone experiences that occasionally. A trick of the imagination. Nothing more. Still, the feeling remained. Persistent. Uncomfortable. I glanced behind me. The street was empty. No one. Only parked cars and reflections dancing across wet pavement. I continued walking. A few minutes later, the sensation returned. Stronger this time. Again, I looked back. Again, there was nobody there. I laughed quietly at myself. You're tired, I thought. That's all. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. When I finally reached my apartment building, relief washed over me. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and immediately felt foolish for being nervous. The entire thing seemed ridiculous. Yet later that night, while lying in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The feeling of being watched. The strange certainty that someone had been nearby. The next day, it happened again. And the day after that. Always when I was walking home alone. Always after dark. Always accompanied by the same uneasy feeling. No evidence. No footsteps. No voices. Just instinct. A growing sense that something was wrong. Then one rainy evening near the end of December, I slipped my father's watch onto my wrist before leaving work. I remember looking at the worn silver case. The familiar scratches, the moving hands. I remember thinking how strange it was that after 11 years it still worked perfectly. I had no idea that within a few days that watch would stop for the first time since my father's death. And when it did, it would save my life. For the next few days I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Not the kind of danger you see coming. It was subtler than that. The kind of feeling that settles quietly in the back of your mind and refuses to leave. Every evening, as darkness covered Manchester, I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, checking reflections in shop windows, listening for footsteps that never seemed to fully disappear. The strange thing was that I never actually saw anyone. Not once. Whenever I turned around, the street would be empty. A passing car, a cyclist, an elderly couple walking a dog. Nothing unusual, nothing threatening, yet the feeling remained. Persistent, watching, waiting. I began changing routes home. At first I told myself it was simply curiosity. A different street, a different shortcut, a different routine, but deep down I knew the truth. I was testing something, trying to see if the feeling followed me. It did. Every route, every night, always after dark, always alone. The city itself seemed different somehow. Manchester had always felt alive, even in winter, even in the rain. But now the streets appeared colder, the shadows deeper, the silence heavier. One Friday evening, I found myself standing at a pedestrian crossing, waiting for the light to change. Rain drifted through the glow of nearby street lamps. Traffic moved steadily. People hurried home beneath umbrellas. Everything looked perfectly normal. Then suddenly, every hair on the back of my neck stood up. The feeling returned, stronger than ever. Someone was behind me. I knew it. I don't know how. Instinct. Evolution. Whatever it was, every part of me screamed the same warning. Someone is there. I turned immediately. Nothing. The pavement stretched behind me. Empty. A few distant pedestrians. No one paying attention to me. No one watching. no one following. Yet, my heart continued pounding. I glanced down at my wrist, at my father's watch. The familiar silver case reflected the streetlights. The second hand moved steadily. Tick, tick, tick. The sound brought an unexpected sense of comfort, the same comfort it always had, as though my father were silently reminding me not to panic. I smiled at the thought, then continued home. That night, I dreamed about him. It wasn't unusual. Over the years, my father appeared in dreams often. Usually the memories were fragmented, brief conversations, half-forgotten moments. Nothing clear, nothing meaningful, but this dream felt different. We were standing in our old garden, the one from my childhood home. The air was warm, the sky bright, exactly the opposite of the cold winter outside my apartment. My father stood near the fence, smiling, the same way he always smiled, calm, patient, safe. For several moments, neither of us spoke. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, and said only 4 words. "Pay attention, Michael." Nothing else. No explanation. No warning. Just those words. Then I woke up. The dream lingered throughout the day. By evening, I had almost convinced myself to forget it. Almost. That same night, heavy rain returned to the city. Sheets of water hammered against office windows. By the time I left work, most people had already gone home. The streets were nearly deserted. I pulled my coat tighter and began walking. Cold wind pushed rain across the pavement. Streetlights reflected in pools of water. Everything felt distant, muted. The route home normally took about 20 minutes. Halfway there, I reached a small public park. It wasn't particularly large, just a narrow stretch of trees, pathways, and open grass between residential streets. During the day, families visited regularly. At night, it became something entirely different. Dark, quiet, empty. I had crossed it hundreds of times before, never thinking twice. That evening, however, the park felt strangely unsettling. Perhaps it was the weather. Perhaps it was the dream. Perhaps it was weeks of growing paranoia. Whatever the reason, unease settled over me immediately. The pathways were deserted. Rain tapped against bare branches overhead. The trees swayed gently in the darkness. I quickened my pace. Then the feeling returned, stronger than ever. Someone was there, not nearby. Close, very close. My pulse accelerated. I glanced behind me. Nothing. Again, no one. Only darkness. Only rain. Only shadows. Yet every instinct told me otherwise. I continued walking. Faster now. The path curved around a cluster of old trees. The nearest street lamp flickered weakly in the distance. For a brief moment, I considered calling someone. Anyone. Just to hear another voice. Then something happened. The watch stopped. At first I didn't notice. Why would I? People rarely pay attention to a watch that's worked flawlessly for over a decade. But suddenly I felt an odd urge to look down. Almost instinctive. Almost automatic. I raised my wrist. The second hand stood perfectly still. Frozen. My footsteps stopped. I frowned. Impossible. The watch had never stopped before. Not once. 11 years. Countless days. Countless nights. Always ticking. Always moving. Yet now it sat motionless beneath the rain. My father's watch had stopped, exactly at 9:17 p.m. For some reason I couldn't look away. The sight felt wrong. Deeply wrong. Then as I stared at it, I turned my head slightly. Only slightly. Just enough. And that's when I saw him. A man standing behind a tree. Watching me. The distance between us couldn't have been more than 15 meters. He was partially hidden by shadows. But I could see enough. Dark clothing. Hood pulled low. Motionless. Waiting. Every drop of blood seemed to drain from my body. For a split second, neither of us moved. Then our eyes met. The reaction was immediate. The man stepped backward, turned, and ran. My heart exploded into motion. Without thinking, I shouted. The sound echoed through the empty park. The man disappeared into darkness, gone within seconds. I stood frozen, breathing hard, rain soaking my coat, my hands trembling uncontrollably. What had just happened? Why had he been hiding? Why was he watching me? And most importantly, how long had he been there? A horrible realization struck me. The feeling, the past weeks, the constant sensation of being followed. Perhaps I hadn't imagined any of it. Perhaps someone really had been watching. The thought made me sick. I left the park immediately, almost running. When I reached home, I locked every door, checked every window, then sat alone in my apartment trying to calm my breathing. Eventually, I called the police. The officer who took my report listened carefully. To my surprise, he didn't dismiss the story. Instead, he asked detailed questions, descriptions, locations, times. When I finished, his expression grew serious, very serious. He exchanged a glance with his colleague. "Mr. Carter," he said quietly, "there have been several incidents in that area recently." My stomach tightened. "What kind of incidents?" The officer hesitated. "Assaults." The word landed heavily. 3 reported attacks in the last 2 months. I felt cold. Very cold. The officer continued. Victims were approached while walking alone at night. The room seemed smaller suddenly, the air heavier, because a terrifying possibility had become impossible to ignore. If I hadn't looked down at my watch, if it hadn't stopped, if I hadn't turned my head, I might never have seen the man hiding behind that tree. I might have continued walking directly toward him. The thought haunted me all night. Sleep never came. Instead, I sat beside the window, staring at the watch resting on my table, frozen at 9:17, silent, lifeless. For the first time since my father's death, it looked like an ordinary object, just metal and glass, nothing more. Yet somehow, deep inside, I couldn't believe that. The timing was too perfect. The coincidence too unlikely. Morning eventually arrived. Gray light filled the apartment. The rain had stopped. Exhausted, I reached for the watch and immediately froze. The second hand was moving. Tick, 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 tick. I stared in disbelief. The watch was running again. Perfectly, smoothly, as though nothing had happened. No repairs, no adjustments, no explanation. Only movement, only time, only the steady rhythm I had known for 11 years. And for the first time since my father died, I began to wonder whether the watch had stopped because it was broken, or because someone had wanted me to notice it. For several days after the incident in the park, I carried the watch everywhere. Not that I hadn't before. The watch had rarely left my wrist since I was 16, but now it felt different, heavier somehow, more important, as though it contained a secret I hadn't yet discovered. The logical part of my mind fought constantly against the idea that anything unusual had happened. Watches stop, mechanical parts fail, coincidences occur. People notice strange details only after something dramatic happens. Every explanation sounded reasonable. Every explanation made sense. Yet none of them felt right, because no matter how often I replayed the events in my head, I always returned to the same question. Why that exact moment? Why had the watch stopped precisely when it did? Not 10 seconds earlier, not 30 seconds later. Exactly when I needed to look down. Exactly when I needed to turn my head. Exactly when I needed to see the man hiding behind the tree. The timing felt impossible, and deep down I couldn't ignore that feeling. The weeks passed slowly. Winter tightened its grip on Manchester. The mornings grew colder. The nights arrived earlier. Life returned to something resembling normal. The police eventually arrested a suspect connected to several assaults in the area. The news should have brought relief. Instead, it left me thoughtful, because the danger had been real. The man had been real. Which meant the watch's warning, however impossible it seemed, had also been real. One Saturday afternoon, while cleaning my apartment, I discovered an old cardboard box hidden in the back of a cupboard. The box had moved with me through 3 different apartments. I hadn't opened it in years. Dust coated the lid. Inside were fragments of another life, photographs, school certificates, old birthday cards, newspaper clippings about the fire, memories I usually avoided. Near the bottom sat a faded envelope. My father's handwriting covered the front. For Michael. My breath caught immediately. I didn't recognize it. Carefully, I opened the envelope. Inside was a folded letter. The paper had yellowed with age. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. The date at the top made my heart stop. It had been written less than a month before he died. I lowered myself into a chair, then began reading. The letter wasn't dramatic. There were no grand speeches, no predictions, no final farewells. It was simply a father writing to his son. He talked about life, responsibility, mistakes, kindness, the importance of staying honest, even when honesty was difficult, the importance of helping people whenever possible. Every sentence sounded exactly like him. I could almost hear his voice. Then I reached the final paragraph, and everything inside me froze. If you ever feel alone, Michael, remember something. I stared at the words. My chest tightened. Even when you cannot see me, I will always try to look after you. For several seconds, I couldn't breathe. The room felt completely silent. Outside, distant traffic moved through the city. Somewhere, a siren echoed, yet all I could hear was my father's voice. I read the sentence again, and again, and again. Eventually, tears blurred the page. Not because I believed the letter explained what happened, not because I suddenly thought ghosts existed, but because the words felt strangely personal now, as though they had crossed 11 years to find me exactly when I needed them. That night I barely slept. Instead, I sat beside the window holding the letter, watching snow drift across the city, thinking about my father, thinking about all the years between then and now, thinking about how much of him still lived inside me. The following week I made a decision. For the first time since the funeral, I visited the fire station where he had worked. The building looked smaller than I remembered, less intimidating. Time has a way of shrinking places from childhood. The station chief welcomed me warmly. Most of the firefighters who knew my father had retired long ago. A few still remained, older now, grayer. Yet when they spoke about him, their faces changed. The years disappeared. For hours, they shared stories. Stories I'd never heard before. One firefighter described a warehouse fire where my father carried an unconscious worker down 3 flights of stairs after everyone else believed the building was empty. Another remembered a flood rescue where he spent hours in freezing water helping stranded families. A third laughed while describing how my father always volunteered for the most difficult assignments. He drove us all mad, the man said with a smile. He never thought about himself. The stories continued, one after another, each one revealing a different side of the man I thought I knew. Not a hero from newspapers, not a legend, just someone who genuinely cared about people, someone who couldn't walk away when help was needed. As I listened, something unexpected happened. For years, my memories of my father had been trapped inside the day he died. Every thought eventually led back to loss, to grief, to absence. But now I remembered something else. His life, the laughter, the kindness, the ordinary moments, the countless ways he influenced people, the countless lives he touched. For the first time in years, thinking about him didn't hurt quite as much. When I finally left the station, evening had already fallen. The city lights reflected across wet streets. Cold air filled my lungs, and for some reason I felt lighter. Not healed, not entirely, but lighter. That night after returning home, I placed the letter beside the watch on my kitchen table. For a long time, I simply sat there looking at them. The 2 most important things my father had left behind. A watch, a letter, neither one particularly valuable. Yet together, they felt priceless. I glanced at the watch. The second hand moved steadily. Tick, tick, tick. Steady, reliable, alive. The familiar sound filled the apartment. Then a thought occurred to me. Perhaps I'd spent years looking at the watch the wrong way. Maybe the important thing wasn't whether it stopped. Maybe the important thing wasn't whether something supernatural had happened. Maybe the real lesson was much simpler. The watch reminded me to pay attention, to stay present, to notice what mattered. Exactly the lesson my father spent his entire life trying to teach me. Outside, snow continued falling softly. The city seemed peaceful. For the first time since the night in the park, I felt no fear, no anxiety, no need for answers. Because whether the watch had saved me through coincidence or something far stranger no longer mattered, the outcome remained the same. I was alive. And because I was alive, I had another day, another opportunity, another chance to become the kind of man my father had always hoped I would be. I picked up the letter one final time, read the last sentence again, then smiled. A genuine smile. The kind I hadn't felt in a long while. There are people who leave this world and disappear, and there are people who leave parts of themselves behind. in memories, in lessons, in kindness, in love. My father belonged to the second kind. Maybe that's why I never truly lost him. Not when the fire took him, not during the lonely years afterward, not even during the darkest nights, because every decision he influenced, every lesson he taught, every act of courage he inspired, was another way he remained beside me. The watch continued ticking, the snow continued falling, and somewhere deep inside, a quiet certainty settled over me. I no longer needed signs. I no longer needed miracles. I no longer needed the watch to stop again, because I finally understood what my father had been trying to tell me all along. Some people never really leave, not when they are loved, not when they are remembered, and certainly not when the best parts of who they were continue living inside the people they leave behind. The watch ticked softly into the night, and for the first time since I was 16 years old, I felt at peace.